This is a podcast from the Angel News Network with Joel Anastasi interviewing Ascended Master Adama as channeled by Philip Elton Collins.
Greetings, beloved humans on the surface of the earth. We come to you from the inner earth civilizations. Many of you are aware of us, many of you are not. I am Adama, one of the high priests from a civilization known as Lemuria, which once had an ancient civilization on the surface of the planet. Today we're going to speak about truth. There is very little truth in your world. Let us talk and begin to give a history of why that is the case. When humanity was first created, and it was created on the surface of the planet, it was an amalgamation of many forces. There was a primitive humanoid life form on the planet, and there were many advanced civilizations coming and going, if you will, over millennia to this particular planet, which was considered to be a Garden of Eden for all of the natural resources that it offered. Many worlds came, advanced worlds came to this particular planet to seek the mining of materials that they needed in order to help repair some of the damages they had done to their own planet. As a result of coming here and harvesting minerals such as gold from the planet many millennia ago, they needed more help in order to help in the mining of these materials in order to help repair their home planets, which they had abused, much like the abuse we are experiencing on this particular planet now, even more so, because those planets were in the peril of being demised if the repairs were not taken in place. Initially, these advanced civilizations, call them what you may, had their own labor forces coming in and exacting the materials from this planet that they needed to take back to their home planets, some within this galaxy, some within other galaxies. They realized more and more that they would need more help, that the individuals that they brought in to do the work were weary of it and began to rebel against it, and they needed what we would call a slave species. So since they had an advanced technology, they took their genes, they spliced it with the primitive humanoid genes of the species that were on the planet at the time, call them what you may, and they created what became human beings. But within that slicing and dicing of the genes, if you will, they created what is called a slave gene, where these individuals could be controlled for a certain period of time. But the spiritual DNA, what is now called by your scientists junk DNA, was a sacred part of all life forms that could not be harmed, or it actually could not even be accessed. But they created what they created, and they had a slave species for quite a long period of time. And eventually, these species became more and more intermarried with the advanced civilizations, and rebellions took place, and human beings became freer than they ever had been before, and the advanced civilizations had accomplished what they wanted to accomplish, and in large part left, but in some parts stayed. Those who stayed and those who intermarried with the humans that had been created from the splicing of the advanced genes became an organization, became a civilization, if you will, what you call today the Illuminati and the Cabal. These forces had been at play for quite some time on the planet, since the beginning of the human species, and had been controlling the financial and the governmental organizations by infiltrating them, creating war, creating chaos within organizations and what later became nations. They became very hidden. They controlled the media. They controlled major corporations that the individuals of this Illuminati and Cabal were a part of or owned. Families such as Morgan, Rockefeller, Rothschild, individuals such as Kissinger, Queen Mary, the Pope. Many individuals inherited, if you will, the power of the Illuminati and the missions of them to create a world government and ultimately control the world. They even most recently have captured technology in situations and communications such as your Twitter, which have allowed them to malign, misinterpret communications, to take untruths and to present them as truth time and time again. So here we are in the densest frequency within the universal plane with these forces at play. And the way to create their demise is to expose them, is to shine a light upon them, realizing they have no national boundaries. There is as many in the United States of America as there is in Europe, Western and Eastern Europe, as there is in China, as there is in your South America. They're all over the world. So, since there are no national boundaries and their motivations are usually power, control, and greed, they stand hidden while standing right in front of you. So we began this discussion with the word truth. It is time for humanity, if they so choose, to really awaken of the truth that we speak of here and to expose these individuals and their organizations and what their intentions are. Every war within your recorded history was ultimately predicated by them to create chaos, to create smoke screens in order to remain hidden. This comes under conspiracy theories for many of you, but in reality, it is reality. And it's time, if you so choose, to begin to understand the hidden forces that have controlled things such as your World Bank, such as your Federal Reserve, to begin to look at corporations such as Visa, Fox, Amazon, and others, and say to yourself, what is really the mission and the intention of these particular organizations? So with this background, with this almost unbelievable background about needing more truth by shining light into your world, let's begin a dialogue of some of the current events that are taking place, such as what's happening in Ukraine, and see if we can connect some more dots. How may I assist you at this time?
Well, thank you, Adama, for joining us today. I have to tell you that was a brilliant kind of condensation of all the forces that have led up to where we are now and the forces that are at play now. Thank you for that.
It is essential that you begin to know the truth of what is exactly happening in order to begin to make new choices, isn't it?
Well, it certainly is. And you use the word, how do we deal with all these dark forces? And you use the word exposed. And trying to look at the positive side of all the nightmare experiences going on right now, there certainly is a great deal of exposure going on as to the forces that are aligned with Russia and the assault on Ukraine, all the autocrats around the world. They're certainly being exposed for who they are, and the New York Times now, our most prominent newspaper, is running a series on the effects of Murdoch and his organization, his media organization, and how they have been undermining democracies on 3 continents, Australia, Europe, and North America.
So it's pretty easy to delineate that such individuals are puppets of what is being discussed, is it not?
I think so, at least for some of us.
So as the planet raises its frequency of ascension, moving into a being of light from whence it came, which is the process taking place now, and humanity on the surface and we in the interior of the planet are all aspects of this ascension process, we can begin to say, do we want to be a part of the solution? Do we want to be a part of increased consciousness by spreading the light onto the darker forces, realizing that the darkness allows humanity to know the light? Without the contrast of the dark to the light in this dense frequency which you exist within, it would be very difficult to know the light. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense. And of course, that would be the jumping off point, for me at least, as to, okay, let's look at a specific situation that represents darkness, the war in Ukraine right now. It seems to be transitioning into a long, bitter struggle. I think Putin and Russia thought they were going to quickly take over Ukraine. That has not happened, and we're watching this horrifying experience of watching a nation being turned into rubble and people being killed by the hundreds. What now?
So as we've just discussed before, the most important thing to realize within this, that this is a struggle of dark and light. This is a struggle of East and West, which has been predicated many times before. Is it not?
Yes.
So as we look at this, and we see all that's taking place, and we begin to understand in our spiritual training and our spiritual sciences, if you will, that is, for humanity, there is no such thing as death, that you are eternal spiritual beings, and you incarnate into these dense human bodies periodically in various incarnational cycles. Individuals, as part of their soul plan, their purpose to be here, make certain sacrifices with specific incarnational cycles in order to predicate the advancement of humanity. Nations do the same thing, since nations have soul plans, purposes to be here, just like individuals have purposes to be here. That is what we are witnessing in the Ukraine. We're seeing a nation showing the world what its purpose in being here is. We are seeing individuals supporting that mission, that soul plan, if you will, by sacrificing their own physical life, realizing that their eternal spiritual life is eternal and cannot die. And you're seeing that. As these take place, some of the horrific events that take place, that is what is necessary, apparently, for humanity on the surface of the planet to evolve. It requires this horrific events to startle, to awaken, to raise people's consciousness in order to act within the light. Do you understand?
I do.
So that is what is taking, when you put all of those parameters in place, you're actually beginning to see the divine order of all of it. Since everything within the universe, the cosmos, is in a divine order. So if you're working within the densest frequency of the universal plane, and that's what the surface of this planet is, it's how you've chosen to learn in being human, you can see the outplay of this. Yes, there was an aggressor who mistakenly assumed they would achieve their ends in short order by, in your vernacular, a bully military force. But what has happened is that it has unified a large part of the democratic world and the non-democratic world, we the people, by the people, for the people ideologies, to come together to support this particular aggressor, this toxic masculinity, if you will. Now, let us understand that the toxic masculinity in this place, that this character, if you will, is also serving a purpose for the evolution and the advancement of humanity. This individual has made a choice also on some obviously unconscious level, most likely, prior to coming here, that he would play this role. That eventually most of the civilized world would support and be against him. So that is very critical to be understanding that things are in a balance of dark and light in order to support the evolution of the planet and humanity themselves. Do you understand?
Yes, can you make a clear statement of what the benefit of this is to the evolution of mankind?
Freedom. You all came to this planet with something called free choice and will. That'll allow you to make mistakes. It'll allow you to make good decisions. Not every planet, not every civilization code has free choice and will. Many are connecting directly to higher frequencies, which this planet once did, and don't need that, don't need free choice and will. But that allows you to make mistakes knowing there are no mistakes. Does that make sense?
And the role of the creation of the United States of America was to give freedom so that we as individual souls could express ourselves fully.
The creation of the United States was an amalgamation of looking at every government of the past, the ones that were tyrannical, the ones that were ruled by royalty, looking at all of those throughout the millennia of the planet and realizing most of them usually failed the common good of the people. So documents were supported in being created to create a government that would negate the failures of the past, yes.
So the United States created a government of the people as opposed to a government of the tyrant or the king or the whoever, where all the control and expression was in the hands of one person.
And we're often in the control of what we are discussing, the Illuminati and the Cabal, or calling themselves royal, but with a sense of entitlement as a result of its connection to these secret organizations. Yes.
And now we're seeing forces that are trying to pull it back to the power being in the hands of the people, to the power being in the hands of a few.
Realizing that ascension is not always a straight path forward. It can be a pull back and forward in order to gain a better perspective to move forthrightly, permanently forward. It's a spiral moving back and forth, not necessarily a straight line. Does that make sense?
It does. I'd like to just bring up for a minute. I'm sorry.
What causes that back and forth is the free will, okay, and the choices. Realizing the choices would not always support the common good. And that's why it goes back and forth rather than in just a linear straight line.
I understand that more than half of the population of the world is still, to some degree, under the control of totalitarian regimes. And of course, the biggest population country of all is China. COVID seems to have shaken things up there, where the government has created a total lockdown. And for the first time, we're seeing people come together to rebel, at least against a lockdown. Can you describe what's going on in China in a way that might be contributing to the eventual development of freedom there?
Remember, you cannot control what you didn't create. So the communist regime, one of the most repressive, largest regimes in the history of the planet, is under the illusion, the delusion, that they can control the free will and free choice of the people. Ultimately, with this built-in spiritual gene that we talked about earlier, ultimately the regime will collapse. If you even look at the recorded history and many other unrecorded histories that don't exist anymore on this particular planet, you would see they all had a natural life and death span, because they were predicated upon the idea that they could control something that they did not create. They didn't create the population, in this case of China. They didn't create the planet that makes their life possible. And so as a result of that, they continue to attempt to place restraints of the freedom of the individual soul, which ultimately will triumph. But in the meantime, the question that the world has to ask themselves, do they want to fuel and finance this government or governments like it in a smaller degree, realizing this Illuminati cabal that we're talking about has no national boundaries. And what it's really looking for is financial gain, power, and seemingly control. So forces are coming in, they're just saying, oh, we're really against this. This is a bad thing. China, you're bad. But at the same time doing business with China, which finances them. The same thing has been happening with the government you call Russia under the leadership of the divine soul called Putin. European nations and even the United States of America until very recently have continued doing business because that was the motive of these hidden financial forces controlling the financial system, and that would fuel and finance the dark side. Do you understand?
I do.
So all of this has to play. Humanity has to look and say, okay, who's supporting what? And why are they supporting it? And that's where the light can be revealed and those who have been hidden can come into view. You're now beginning to examine corporations who are pulling out of doing business with these regimes which are working with the dark energy. In the past, many of them fueled by these hidden forces of greed and control and financial gain did not care what the motive or the structure of the regime was, as long as they benefited monetarily. That has to come to an end if the human species on the surface of the planet is going to advance. Do you understand?
Yes, what you just said, of course, also applies to the issue of freedom of the press, how the right-wing media has exploited freedom of the press to spread disinformation and the dissolution of democracies in many places of the world. And of course, how do you deal with that kind of media when we need to preserve freedom of the press in order to preserve freedom? So that was a dilemma, it seemed to me. And one of the things you just said about asking what are they really supporting and making a decision on the part of corporations and others as to, is this what I want to support?
Exactly, and individuals who invest in these very corporations, you look more closely and say, I'm not buying that stock. I'm not supporting that company that's doing that. I don't like how that particular media outlet, media organization is acting and what they're saying. It is not for the common good of all. And is it telling the truth? They build upon telling a mistruth or a lie often enough, redefining it as a truth at some point because we've said it a lot of times. And you see a great deal of that happening in today's world. But the first thing these hidden forces do is control the media. And what has happened in your modern times is that entire factions have no longer become news outlets, they have become propaganda outlets. So the higher forces gifted humanity with something called cyberspace and allowed you to have free will and free choice with the use of it and how it would play out. And you have seen some of the abusive results of how it has been used in a negative or dark way. Now it's up to the majority of the people, if they so choose, to use that for light, to shed the light upon the darkness, to expose those who are acting in a dark vernacular. The article that you just were sharing within your New York Times is an example of how things can be exposed.
You know, you mentioned the technology of the internet and so on. Of course, Archangel Gabriel has talked about that being a gift from the higher realms to empower individuals to overcome the constraints of organizations, governments and organizations to to control the voice of the individual, and the empowerment of the individual by the internet and so on and other technology is being demonstrated. I heard discussed in a recent conversation with a ex-Russian journalist who is not in Russia right now for obvious reasons, talking about how the young people of Russia, many young people in Russia, have been able to evade the controls of Russian media and communicate with each other and to the larger population about what is really going on in Ukraine, overwhelming the control of the Russian government. I don't know how powerful a source that is, but I certainly took note of the fact that it was happening.
Truth has always been available, even under major constraints, if a divine soul so chooses it. Freedom has always been available for the divine soul who so chooses it. You've looked at slavery throughout the history of your planet. Actually, there are more people enslaved now than ever before in one way or another, whether it's financial debt or sexual slavery or whatever it might be. But within the cultures of master and slavery, within that spiritual gene, within those human individuals, those divine soul individuals, there's always been a thread of seeking the freedom and seeking the truth. And ultimately, it always plays out because love is the basis and the building block of all creation. It is a loving university that will ultimately allow humanity, in this case, in the densest frequency of the universal plane, to go through whatever permutations and gyrations back and forth that are necessary for your advancement. But at the end of the day, the outcome will always be freedom. It will always be truth based upon love.
Well, that was a powerful summary. Thank you so much. Would you add anything else, Adama, before we complete this conversation?
Never give up. We once lived on the surface of the planet under some pretty dire circumstances when one nation, Atlantis, was in nuclear war against us. And we devastated much of the surface of the planet. It's why we got a spiritual dispensation to go into the interior of the planet. Many of your civilizations who disappeared, the Hopi, the Mayan, the advanced Egyptians, really transmuted into higher frequencies of existence. There is so much of reality and existence that humanity on the surface of the planet does not understand. But please know, beloved humans on the surface of this planet, I, being the father of humanity, and that you have known it, have no fear, have no doubt, have no ignorance about the divine soul plan of this planet, which is love, is to return to the light. And you as well, if you so choose, through your free will and choice. So be it.
Thank you, Adama.